Committee will come to order. Let me welcome and appreciate our witnesses for being here, as well as members and guests. Whether the term used is political warfare, influence operations, psychocultural warfare, indirect warfare, hybrid warfare, or one of the many others that have been suggested, it's clear that the United States and our allies are under consistent attack using non-kinetic tactics designed to undermine and weaken us. We know that Russia intervened in a variety of ways to sow dissension during the 2016 election. History and now declassified documents establish that the former Soviet Union had a track record of active measures against NATO's deployment of intermediate-range missiles in Europe, for example. And those active measures included providing propaganda themes to peace movement groups, as well as organizational expertise, financial resources, forged U.S. military documents, et cetera, et cetera. And according, again, to declassified CIA documents, that campaign was built upon a similar campaign they carried out against the proposed neutron bomb deployment in 1977 and 78. The point is, it's all part of a standard playbook, and we should expect more of the same, including against decisions called for example, in the Nuclear Posture Review. While most of the attention has been centered on Russia as the source of these attacks, they are not the only adversary using such methods. China has spent billions of dollars to gain economic leverage, buy access to infrastructure, and shape public opinion and perceptions around the world to its advantage. Iran, various terrorist organizations, and even North Korea make use of them as well. These tactics challenge our traditional ways of thinking about warfare. They challenge our organizational structure on who's responsible for defending the country in this sphere. And they challenge our ability to develop and use tools needed to deal with them in a timely way. As the National Defense Strategy says, China and Russia want to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model, gaining veto authority over other nations' economic, diplomatic, and security decisions. And that was a quote. It is important for us to identify the motive behind these efforts, but the question remains whether we have the tools, the organizations, and the approaches to protect American sovereignty and national security. We hope to gain insight into these issues from our distinguished panel of witnesses, but first let me yield to the ranking member for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree substantially with all of your remarks about the importance of this. And really, it's a fairly simple process, and we're kind of failing at every level right now in terms of our information operations. I mean, first of all, if you're going to engage in an information operation, you need to know what your message is. What's our message? What is it we're trying to convey? How are we trying to influence people? Now, I think there are a couple of very large issues there. One, we want to promote economic and political freedom as the ideal form of government and push that forward. We have not been conveying that message particularly well. And I think the second piece is to counter extremism and all forms of extremism. Certainly we're familiar with ISIS and al-Qaeda, but they are not alone in their extremist views, and it is not just peculiarly people who bastardize the Islamic religion. It happens on other religions and other ideologies as well. So we need to be against extremism and for political and economic freedom. How do we communicate that? Well, to begin with, like I said, I don't think we've even sort of settled on that message. And then second, once you decide what your message is, you got to decide who your audience is. Who are we trying to persuade? And I think most important in that is, how do those people get their information? So ideally, if we have an information operation going on, we've got a message, we've got an audience, and we've got delivery mechanisms. And what has become clear is that the delivery mechanism right now is over the internet, is social media platforms, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or Twitter. That's what drives messages out there that get to people. And if nothing else, I hope that what the Russians have helped do is make us aware of how that works. Because I think there was an understanding that the internet was obviously a brand new form of messaging here a couple decades ago, but we never really figured out how to use it exactly. The Russians figured out how to use it. They figured out how to say, okay, this is our message. We're going to get it on the internet and get it on there in a way that it spreads. Part of that is setting up the bots, the automatic, retweeting and sending out information. But beyond that, identifying sympathetic people. So you don't even have to do it through, sort of fake or the bot approach. You simply find sympathetic people and then make sure you get your message to them and make sure that they spread it. The Russians have figured out how to weaponize the internet in an information campaign in a way that we did not. We now have a template, as they, I don't have any problem with imitating the Russians in terms of making use of these platforms. They've shown us how to do it. Now we just need to do it. But we are not committed to that. And I think the largest problem is there is a lot of commitment in this room. I think the members of this committee, I think the members of Congress, I haven't heard too many Democrats or Republicans who don't completely agree with all of this. What is missing is the executive branch, and they're really rather important in this. The State Department, as near as I can tell, isn't even really engaging in an information campaign. And I know the Pentagon is trying, but this has to be a whole of government approach if we're going to be effective at it. And I think USAID and some of our development efforts are important in delivering this message. And we're not there. Now, I will just briefly touch on the sensitive topic before stopping, and that is it starts with the president. The president has been unwilling to do this. Now, we can guess at a lot of different reasons for that. It seems like he's really worried about admitting at how good the Russians are at this for fear that somehow it will taint his election. As a Democrat, I want to say he won, okay? Don't question that at all. And really whether, whatever any of his campaign officials were doing, what the Russians did matters just because they did it, even if there was or wasn't any collusion. We've got to engage in that. We have got to get the White House to decide that this is important and to engage. More troubling is that the president doesn't seem to agree with the first part of that message that I said, that economic and political freedom matter. Now, he got a lot of grief here recently for calling up President Putin and congratulating him on his election, which, as John McCain said it better than anybody, the leader of the free world doesn't call up a dictator and congratulate him on winning a sham election. But it sort of undermines the political freedom message. But more troubling to me was last year when the president called up President Erdogan in Turkey to congratulate him on the success of the constitutional referendum that they passed. And the constitutional referendum that they passed was to clamp down on opposition, was to consolidate authoritarian power. So does the President of the United States even agree with the message that political and economic freedom are things that we're supposed to promote? And I understand it's complicated. There are times when we face threats. We have allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and elsewhere that are not necessarily engaging in what we want them to. How do you balance that? It's difficult. But right now, it doesn't seem like the White House is trying to balance it. They seem to be perfectly content to support the authoritarian approach. That's troubling, and we need to change that. With that, I yield back and look forward to the testimony.
Let me welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses. We have General Phillip Breedlove, former commander of U.S. European Command and Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, Mr. John Garnaut, who's former senior advisor to Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, and Honorable Michael Lumpkin, who is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, as well as coordinator of the Global Engagement Center at the U.S. State Department. Just because I mentioned a few formers doesn't mean these guys don't have a lot more in their bio, which was provided to all members. Without objection, your full written statements will be made part of the record, and we'd be pleased to hear any opening comments each of you would like to make. General Breedlove, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and other members of the committee for the opportunity to speak with you about Russian interference in democratic processes. The Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election is deeply troubling, but not surprising. It is up to us as Americans to acknowledge the threats that Russian disinformation provides and to develop the effective strategies needed to combat them. This weaponization of information by Russia is not new, as you have mentioned. In fact, it dates back to the Soviet Union. In 1983, a pro-Soviet newspaper in India published an article accusing the Department of Defense of creating AIDS in an attempt to develop new biological weapons. In '64, the KGB used similar tactics in an effort to convince the Indonesian president that there was a CIA plot to assassinate him. The primary differences between these disinformation campaigns and those of today is twofold. First, the internet and social media, as you have stated, make it so much easier to spread disinformation. And secondly, these campaigns are increasingly targeting first world Western nations. Russia took full advantage of this new media landscape by promoting disinformation to sow discontent among Americans. It exploited divides in the American populace to promote what many have referred to as culture war. Surveys have shown that the U.S. is more polarized than it has ever been on issues such as gun control, immigration, religion, and race, and Russian operatives, seeing an opportunity, have purchased social media advertisements and created profiles in order to promote partisan instances on their issues to further widen those rifts. Russian advertisements and profiles did not have a consistent political position. The only consistent aspect is that they all promoted partisan positions on immensely divisive issues. The details of Russia's interference in the election are maddening. However, the reality is that we should not be surprised by this interference. The Russians have interfered with numerous elections in Western nations recently, including those in the Netherlands, Germany, and France. There is increasing evidence that Russia worked to influence the referendum in which the UK decided to leave the European Union, and recently has shown a report prepared by some on the, as shown in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee report. It has promoted anti-immigration sentiment in Europe by creating and spreading the story of poor Lisa, a 13-year-old girl who, as the fallacious story goes, was abducted and raped by migrants. Further, we ourselves have meddled in elections in our own way, and we have to face those facts. In 1953, Allen Dulles offered $5 million to an agent to sway the Filipino elections. In 1958's Operation Booster Shot encouraged rural Laotian farmers to vote against communist politicians in Laos. Our meddling did not end with the Cold War. In the 2006 Palestinian elections in Gaza, the United States provided economic assistance in an attempt to bolster Fatah's chances. The reality is that both the United States and Russia have meddled, and we should not be surprised if the trend continues. What is astounding about Russian meddling is how brazen Russia has been in executing it, as well as the fact that Russia seems to believe that it can escape this with its reputation unsullied. Russia appears to be surprised by the outrage that has been seen throughout the U.S. The U.S. has been a leader and a pillar of Western democracy, and the fact that Russia believed that it could interfere with American elections with no response is what's shocking to me. However, Russia's interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election is merely a symptom of a larger hybrid war against the West, in which economic, cyber, and disinformation tactics are used in conjunction with conventional forces in order to exert force or pressure on an adversary. In February 2013, General Valery Gerasimov, Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Russia, gave a speech entailing this strategy. He claimed, "The very rules of war have changed. The role of non-military means in achieving political and strategic goals has grown. In many cases, they have exceeded the power of force of weapons in their effectiveness. The focus of applied methods of conflict has altered the direction of the broad use of political, economic, informational, humanitarian, and other non-military measures applied in coordination with the protest potential of the population." This has led to the coining of the term the Gerasimov Doctrine. This describes Russia's view that warfare is not simply a conventional affair, but one that uses the aforementioned cyber, economic, and information tactics. This is notable because it shows Russia acknowledges that its election meddling is a form of warfare. While Russia may deny that it interferes with elections or claim that it is innocuous, the words of General Gerasimov ring loud and clear. Disinformation efforts are efforts of warfare. The reality is that Russia is using hybrid tactics to target Western values, democratic governments, and transatlantic institutions. President Vladimir Putin claimed in a State of the Nation address that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major geopolitical disaster in the 20th century. Russia sees the West, and in particular a unified West, as an adversary. Waging a conventional war against the West would be unfavorable to Russia. As such, it has used hybrid warfare to break up Western unity. Exploiting divisions in U.S. society and promoting a culture war is one key element of Moscow's efforts to weaken the West. Through disinformation, it has applied differences in Europe to promote Euroscepticism and to grow the notion among the peoples of Europe that the EU is not beneficial. It has waged cyber attacks such as the NotPetya attack in Ukraine in 2017, the Fancy Bear attack of German members of parliament earlier this month, or the numerous distributed denial of service attacks on the Estonian government. It has used economic subversion to exploit the relatively smaller economies of neighbors to subvert political power. Russia uses its vast energy resources to promote the dependence of its smaller neighbors, working to keep them in a Russian sphere of influence and preventing them from turning to the West. The Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election has received an unprecedented amount of media coverage. However, we should not be so limited as to see this interference in a vacuum. In order to effectively combat this interference, we need to understand the scope of Russian hybrid warfare. We need to view this as a comprehensive problem that connects the dots of recent Kremlin activity. We cannot simply take a stance against a specific case of election interference. We must take a stance against Russian hybrid warfare in its entirety. In all the cases of Russian disinformation and election interference, the West has been slow to see it and even slower to react. We need to move past simply trying to formulate a reaction to interference in this election, and we need to move to a place where we are ready to combat hybrid warfare and get past reacting. Hybrid warfare is a form of warfare that the United States has yet to fully understand, never mind prepare for. The revelation of Russian disinformation in the election is a wake-up call that hybrid warfare is occurring, even if we are unwitting. Simply condemning the election meddling is not going to solve the problem, and it's not going to prevent future Russian hybrid operations. We must treat this with the gravity that it deserves. We need to take a position, establish policy, and then execute it. The Russian hybrid threat is larger than the election and larger than the United States. It is a threat to the liberal order that the West has become accustomed to, and it will continue to be until we develop an effective strategy and implement the necessary policies to combat it. Sir, thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Garnaut?
Thank you, Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members. Thank you for having me along today. Is this microphone okay?
If you could just speak directly into it, because it's directional, and so if it's off to the side, it doesn't work as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, to understand the mechanics of China's international influence, we have to look beyond the gravitational pull of the Chinese economy and the war-fighting power of the People's Liberation Army. That's what we usually focus on, but I think, and they're both important, but to me the more interesting and the more important space is in between those two poles, and that is the space of influence and interference. This is the space where the Chinese Communist Party manipulates incentives inside our countries in order to shape the conversation, manipulate perceptions, and tilt the political and strategic landscape to its advantage. The party works relentlessly to find common interests and cultivate relationships of dependency with its chosen partners. The modus operandi is to offer privileged access, to build personal rapport, and then to reward those who deliver. From open source materials, we can see this happening in universities, in business communities, in ethnic Chinese diaspora communities, in media and entertainment, and also in politics and government itself. But the institutions and the ideologies and the methodologies are so alien to our systems, we're having trouble seeing it, let alone responding to it. The party has, to use its own terms, been winning without fighting. However, under the uncompromising leadership of President Xi Jinping, China's activities have become so brazen and so aggressive that we can't ignore it any longer. A re-evaluation is taking place across half a dozen democracies in the world, including the United States and Australia, and this conversation is now taking root in many other countries as well. I've described the Australian experience in an article this month in Foreign Affairs magazine, which I've attached to my written submission. I won't duplicate that here, but I want to underscore what I think is the most important message from the Australian experience. And that is the importance of having analytical clarity, of working with principles, and responding with strategy. Our challenge, and the challenge of democracies across the world, is to work with the strengths and shore up the vulnerabilities of our open, multicultural democratic systems. We need a rigorous and principled approach that is capable of supporting a broad and durable consensus within countries and between countries. We need to conceptually separate the black, the covert, from the white, and recognise that there's a large grey area of ambiguity and plausible deniability that sits in between. This process requires a great deal of empirical work, both in and outside government. But once we have the empirical baseline, and we've worked out which activities we care about and how much we care, then we can start to formulate and design a surgical response that manages the risks and targets the harm without harming ourselves. In my view, we should continue to welcome ordinary diplomacy and public diplomacy and economic activity that does not come with strings attached. But wherever there is covert, corrupting or coercive behaviour, when the legitimate and transparent influence processes cross the line into harmful interference, then we need to be uncompromising ourselves. Shutting down the black, the covert, the coercive, the corrupting, is primarily a counterintelligence and law enforcement challenge, a very big one, but it won't be enough on its own. We also have to build transparency and accountability mechanisms to illuminate the grey. We need to reinforce and reactivate the natural antibodies of our civil societies, the natural antibodies that the party, the Communist Party, has been working to suppress and in some cases disable. In Australia, the Turnbull government has been developing a counter-interference strategy that is built upon the principles of sunlight, enforcement, deterrence and capability. The strategy is country agnostic in that it is designed to apply to any country that misbehaves, not just China. And the strategy includes new legislation that is targeted at both the black and the grey. One set of laws introduces tough but graduated criminal provisions against political interference and espionage. Another set of laws imposes disclosure obligations for those working in Australian politics on behalf of a foreign principal. This is an updated transparency regime which is loosely modelled on your Foreign Agents Registration Act. Importantly, enforcement activities are also being brought within a central integrated hub. But this is only the very early stages of a long struggle to reinforce the integrity of our democratic processes. There is an enormous body of work that needs to be done, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Lumpkin.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity today to address you on the topic of state and non-state actor influence operations. I believe the Congress has correctly identified such information operations as an ongoing and persistent threat to U.S. national security interests. Unfortunately, based on my previous experience in government, I'm similarly convinced that we have quite a ways to go before we actually get it right in order to protect and defend those national interests in the modern information environment. Since the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, which arguably was the last period in history when the U.S. successfully engaged in sustained information warfare and counterstate propaganda efforts, advances in technology have enabled instantaneous global communications. We are living in a hyper-connected world where the flow of information moves across borders in real time and across traditional and social media platforms. The lines of authority and effort between public diplomacy, public affairs, and information warfare have blurred to the point where in many cases information is consumed by U.S. and foreign audiences at the same time via the same methods. While the means and methods of communication have transformed dramatically, most of the laws and policies governing how the U.S. government responds to sophisticated operations and disinformation campaigns by foreign adversaries have remained largely unchanged. It's true there's been some tinkering, there's been some tweaking, but nothing substantive or transformational. Simply put, our institutions have not kept pace with the evolving threats. Antiquated bureaucratic structures and traditional lines of authority remain a significant impediment to progress. To date, there is not a single individual in the United States government below the President of the United States who is responsible for managing U.S. information dissemination and providing strategic guidance for how to confront our adversaries in the information environment. While the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act mandated that the Global Engagement Center, or GEC, lead, organize, and synchronize U.S. government counter-propaganda and disinformation efforts against state and non-state actors abroad, it failed to elevate the head of the GEC to a position of authority commensurate with its expansive mission. The GEC operates at the Assistant Secretary level and lacks the necessary authority to direct the interagency. In practice, this means that the GEC is considered at best a peer to a half-dozen regional or functional bureaus at the State Department and numerous disparate organizations at the Department of Defense. This is, needless to say, the other departments have equity stakes in this space as well. Simply put, although the GEC is directed by law with mission to lead interagency, the practical reality is that its role is reduced to simply suggesting function, which agencies can choose to follow or not to follow as they see fit. The result is a significant misalignment of responsibility, authority, and accountability, which will continue until this is changed in statute. It's not unreasonable to think that the U.S. will always be at some disadvantage against our adversaries in the information environment. We are a nation of laws, where truth and ethics are expected, and rightly so. Our enemies, however, aren't facing the same constraints. Our adversaries, both state and non-state actors, can and will continue to bombard all forms of communication with their messages in attempts to influence public perception, create doubt of our actions or intentions, and recruit people to their cause. We must ensure that we organize U.S. government efforts in such a manner that maximizes desired outcomes through discipline, agility, and innovation. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I'll just mention that a number of members of this committee are also members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and looking at the issue that you mentioned about the appropriate level of the director of the Global Engagement Center is something I think that a number of members probably should look at on both committees because it's their jurisdiction. I think a lot of the questions that y'all are going to get are going to be about what we do. But I want to just take a moment to shine a little brighter light on what's happening, because I think understanding is really critical as a first step. A lot of attention, as we all know, to what happened in the 2016 election. And so there are recommendations even this week about shoring up our electoral process. I don't think there's been as much attention devoted to these other countries trying to influence our decisions. And I mentioned, as did General Breedlove, some of these efforts in the past to prevent us from deploying the Pershing II and the Glickums in the 80s or the neutron bomb in the 70s, how they are continuing to be involved, have been involved historically in trying to make sure that we didn't make national security decisions that would run counter to their interests. And so that's the reason when I think about the nuclear posture review or various, other funding decisions that this committee has to make, I worry about those attempts continuing, but us not recognizing it. General Breedlove, could you elaborate just a little bit, because you've been on the front lines of this, about, in your case especially, the Russian attempt to not just influence our elections, but influence the political decisions we make, especially in the area of national security. And then, Mr. Garnaut, if you could help us think about the ways the Chinese are attempting to influence not just our elections or our perception of them, but the decisions we make that affect national security. General Breedlove?
Thank you, Chairman. I completely agree with the statement before your question. I would point out, for instance, what happened when Russia first went into Crimea and then into the Donbass. Russia clearly had a very localized overmatch when it came to military forces, but if all of NATO awakened, it could rapidly have changed. And so what we saw was a campaign that started immediately with very bellicose talk, to include what I have called in this room before loose talk about nukes, in order to try to influence the decisions of the West about how they would respond to what was going on. So very broadly, in cases like the Ukraine, they've tried to influence us. And I would also say that some of the actions early in Syria are of the same ilk. The long-range shots out of the Caspian Sea into Syria had very, very little tactical effect. And I think they were mainly taken to show the West, look, we can range your capitals from the Caspian Sea. Don't mess with us. And so I think in every case, as we look at application of Russian capabilities, we need to have our eyes open to a broader message, because they are trying to, as you said, Chairman, influence our decisions in these spheres.
Thank you. Mr. Garneau?
Yeah, there's lots of parallels between Russia and China, and they're fascinating, and sometimes they're illuminating. One of the parallels is the effort to fragment alliance systems. So certainly in Australia and elsewhere, there's a huge amount of effort to weaken the commitment of allies to the United States and to each other. And part of that, I think, is quite a sophisticated messaging system, which is kind of inconsistent when all together, but you can see how it works. And one is the message that China is inherently and possibly uniquely peaceful. You don't need to set up your armed forces because they're peaceful. That's it. Two, the second message is that China's rise is inexorable. So even if you don't like it, there's nothing you can do. Resistance is futile. The third message, which is contradictory to the first, but it comes out from different channels, back channels, and is really important when targeted at certain times, is that actually China's really dangerous and it's ruthless, and if you get in the way, it's going to really hurt. And so it's this orchestra of messages which has worked to manipulate the public opinion, elite opinion backdrop, and the mental wallpaper of decision makers as they're making decisions about their own force capabilities and build-up and their commitment to the US alliance system and other security partners.
It's helpful. Thank you. Let me yield to Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I will go where the chairman suggested. What could we be doing better, or put differently, if you were to say, here's the plan, and you could walk over and be God for the moment in the White House in terms of how we do a better job of countering all of this very aggressive messaging that the Russians, the Chinese, and extremists are pushing, how would you organize that as a starting point? Who in our government plays the most important role? White House, NSC, Pentagon, State Department. What would the team look like?
Congressman, so let me take the first stab at it, and I may or may not actually hit what you're shooting at, but I want to offer that we are here sort of talking about the information piece of this conflict that we're in, and I think first and foremost we need to recognize that we're actually in a conflict. The second thing I would offer in how to organize our response is to understand that our opponent is broadly attacking us. I use that very simple model, DIME, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, to describe a nation's power. There are much more sophisticated models, but for a fighter pilot, that works. And what we see as our opponent is attacking us diplomatically at the values that we have and that our legitimacy in the West. It's attacking us, as we have talked about in this committee, in the information space in incredible ways. In Europe, Russia is now using force again to change internationally recognized borders. And then Russia, as we talked about, is using its economic sphere to influence pricing and availability of fuel to nations that need it. So
I'm sorry, but that's not what I asked. It's all very helpful, but we've heard that. What would the team look like? I mean, if I can just give you an analogy that I think worked for us, is after 9/11, General McChrystal kind of led the notion that we are being attacked by a network, and it takes a network to beat a network. So we went to an elaborate effort to understand what that network was that was attacking us, and then we built our own network. And all over the world, every morning, all the different pieces of that, and I won't get into all the different pieces of it, got together at 7 a.m. East Coast time and said, how are we doing? What's going on here? What's going on there? What piece of it do you have? FBI, whoever. I think we need that type of comprehensive approach. And I just want, what's the first step? What's the building block to build that counter narrative?
slow to get to my conclusion, which was we have to have an all-of-government response, and that has to be led somewhere, either an empowered GEC to bring all of government together, or an entity in the NSC to bring all of government together. But we need to respond in an all-of-government way.
And right now, it's fair to say nobody's in charge, right? There's some people doing a few things here and there, but there's no person who's like, I get up this morning, my job is to counter this information campaign.
I think it's correct.
Okay.
And sir, if I
you
could
have
add, is I kind of think of the information space as we have an orchestra. What we don't have is a conductor. And we need to have a single person that is held accountable for U.S. government information efforts.
Just quickly on that piece, since there are kind of like, there's several different pieces here. One obviously is the, Russia, well, there's Russia and their efforts to, undermine democracy and freedom. There's China and their efforts to do the same. There's the violent extremist groups that we're trying to counter. And then there's what the chairman mentioned is the collective effort to, interfere in our politics, not just in the elections, but in our decision-making process. Is it possible, you think, to wrap all of that into one thing and say, okay, you're in charge of here's the information warfare, you got to cover it all?
I think what we've done as a nation correctly is we created the Director of National Intelligence to get 17 intelligence agencies together, kind of marching in the same line.
Working on these.
And they also advocate for budgets, resourcing, legislation, people. I mean, again, I always can tell people's priorities where you put your resources, your people, money, and your time. And I would offer is that we don't have a whole-of-government approach to this. When I took over the GEC, we had a $5.6 million base budget.
Yeah. Thank you.
If I could add just to that, from the China angle, they're very good at playing off the different silos of our systems against each other. So if I can only underscore what General Breedlove was saying about the importance of elevating this issue and making it very clear the strategic importance of this issue, and then decisions flowing down to each part of our system rather than the individual bureaucracies and agencies coming up with their own solutions and trying to sort of horse trade at the top.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Conway.
Well, thanks, Chairman. Our Intel Committee will release tomorrow, we think, findings and recommendations of what we thought the Russians did or didn't do, protecting our elections and the systems that we have in place, the voter registration and the tallying systems, all those kind of things are a little more mechanical. The real fight, as the Chairman may have said, and General Breedlove said, is between the ears of Americans. And how do you protect? Jefferson wrote extensively about how valuable an educated public is to the preservation of democracy. And I'm looking right now at RT America, RT Russia Today, which is a Putin tool to propagandize in America. And you've got Jesse Ventura has a show on there, Ed Schultz has a show on there, Larry King has a show on there. I assume they know who they're working for, but the American people may not. So how do we, and this is more just a statement than a question, but the real issue for us is how do we make sure that Americans aren't improperly influenced in a free society where free press, where anybody can get access to these channels? How do we make sure Americans understand who they're listening to, who they're being influenced by? Because at the end of the day, Putin's real issue was, can I get somebody to vote differently than they would otherwise voted had I not engaged in this fight? And that is probably not an Armed Services Committee circumstance, but helping the American people understand where the risks are. Looking at like RT, you pull up, it looks like it's a regular, legitimate American news source. When truth of the matter is, at its core, is a Putin-driven propaganda machine. So. Just a statement, Mr. Chairman. I don't have much of a question in that regard because really this issue is more how do we make sure Americans, when they go to the polls, have in mind the right person to vote for or against based on legitimate sources. So if any of the three have a comment in that regard, I'd be happy to listen to you. All right, yield back. Thank you.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for being here. I really appreciate your remarks. I think we all do. You've talked, and certainly Mr. Lumpkin, you've talked about the Global Engagement Center, and you've talked about the need for a conductor. But where is the executive in this? How important would be the executive to an elevated and empowered GEC? And could it actually not be that important if it wasn't seen as critical to the country? Where does it stand?
Well,
What do you think?
I mean, I kind of scratch my head sometimes wondering, where is the executive right now in this process? I mean, I think what we see is information operations are military operations, information operations to support, military objectives. We have the public affairs team out there, messaging to the American population. We have the State Department who's focusing on the public diplomacy, which is influencing populations abroad. The gaps and seams in those are massive. And not only do you have the gaps and seams between them, but you have the hyper-connected world where what goes on in the public affairs is reached near simultaneously internationally. What happens in country X affects and it hits the American populations. So the world has changed on how we consume, manage information, and what flows where. But our silos are still there. Mm-hmm. Our silos still exist. And this committee, in conjunction with their counterparts in the Senate, have done some tremendous work in the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act. In fact, it took the Armed Services Committee to legislate in the State Department on how they manage information because it wasn't getting done. So I do think it starts here to get the executive going in the right direction, but I think it's time to do a holistic look in as far as how we manage information. There may be time for a Control-Alt-Delete and look at new ways to do business. And I think elevating the GEC or a GEC-like element may be the right course of action.
Mm-hmm. General, did you want to respond?
Just
Where do we start?
a small add-on. I really like the words Mr. Garneau used. This should be a top-down driven thing. It doesn't have to be the executive, but if it's not the executive, then the executive needs to empower someone below them, give them authority, responsibility, and accountability for the mission, and then tell them to move out.
Mr. Garnaut, did you want to respond?
No, I won't add to that.
All right, great, thank you. As you know, the whole of government approach that we tried to work with after 9/11 was, how do you think that was transformative on some levels? What did we accomplish? Why did we accomplish that and not accomplish other things?
I think it's, first of all, there was an immediate call to action because of the event that happened, because the horrific nature of what 9/11 did to the psyche of the American people, as well as physically damaging and hurting families and the American people writ large. Until we have that, I've learned that policy generally doesn't make itself. You need a forcing function. I would like to think that people are awake enough based on what's happened and what's happening in the information environment that it's time to do something about it before something horrific does happen.
I'm thinking also about our relationships with our NATO partners. And certainly, General Breedlove, you were very involved with NATO. We know that in many ways, it's really our Western nations are strong, but that also makes us susceptible because of our institutions. How do you think we do address these issues as with our partners without compromising those values?
So let me agree, Congresswoman, with something you said, which is important. And sometimes our strengths, which are our freedoms and our values, make us vulnerable. We are not accountable to the truth in the way we operate in these public spaces or we are accountable to the truth in these public spaces while our enemies are not. And so I am not in favor of stooping to the wrong type of tactics in reply and compromising our strengths. And that's what I see in NATO as well. Western democracies, Western values, Western institutions are one of the first targets of these kind of efforts coming from our opponents.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. We appreciate you highlighting such important issues that have been great concern of the committee over years. One issue in particular that I recognize is working on China's ongoing influence campaign through the establishment of Confucius Institutes across the United States. Currently, and this is a question for each of you, there are 103 active Confucius Institutes that were described in 2009 by Li Changcheng, the head of propaganda for the Chinese Communist Party, as, quote, an important part of China's overseas propaganda setup, end of quote. It is for this reason that yesterday I introduced legislation H.R. 5336, the Foreign Influence Transparency Act, which would require transparency of these institutes through modifying the Foreign Agent Registration Act for disclosure. Do you believe it's appropriate to require organizations like the Confucius Institutes to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act? And additionally, it's been 23 years since the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, has been last updated. What recommendations would you give to the committee on how it should be changed to deal with Confucius Institutes or other influence operations that you have discussed today?
Well, thank you, and I did note those reports with interest. Now, Australia's had a close look at your FARA legislation. We didn't have any before, so we're coming from a standing start. And I think what we've tried to do in Australia is to broaden the definitions a little bit to account for the fact that a lot of foreign interference is indirect. You know, FARA tends to be focusing on a more contractual relationship, so you need to have some broader definitions. And I think that the direction you've taken with that draft legislation is very encouraging, and leaving aside whether or not the Confucius Institutes themselves should be registered. I think that's the right direction, because what they do is partly propaganda, but I think even more importantly is their connection to the United Front's work department system. And that is that they can potentially be used, or we need to stop them being used, as a platform within universities for influencing decision-making in universities, as well as being having an element of propaganda in itself. I think your expansion of the FARA legislation is certainly a very encouraging thought.
Thank you.
I absolutely agree. I think we need to look at the definitions of within the FARA to see what's included and what's not, and maybe take a fresh look at them. But these legislation, first glance, looks really, really good. So I'm pleased you did that. Thank you.
Thank you, General.
Sir, just to save your time, I would just completely align myself with the concept of transparency.
Thank each of you for that. And Mr. Lumpkin, given your previous experience as Special Envoy and Coordinator for the Global Engagement Center, could you inform the committee as to ways in which this committee can support their mission, whether it be increased authority, funding, or coordination with SOCOM in their counter-propaganda efforts? Do you believe more can be done to ensure their success, as I believe their mission is absolutely critical?
I do. Thank you. I think one of the pieces, as I mentioned, is they need to be fully empowered to effectively execute across the interagency, to include U.S. SOCOM as one of the combatant commands. I additionally believe they need to be resourced, not only with money, but with people and with leadership. Since my departure in 2017, there's been an acting special envoy, and I would like to see somebody permanently put into that place to guide that institution. But I do think that one of the key pieces is to elevate them to the point where they can have a compelling and effective voice. I think the other piece that the committee could do is hearings always assist in transparency. So I think that hearings on these subjects like this one go a long way on moving forward.
Thank you very much. And General Breedlove, the governments of the UK, US, France, and Germany have recognized the use of the nerve agent Novichok as offensive use of weapons. Do you believe that the use constitutes an act of war? If so, what should the UK or allies do to reciprocate?
Thank you for the question. And I've quickly found when I was the head of NATO, I couldn't determine what was an act of war. The NAC got to do that. But I would definitely construe it as a warlike action on a friendly soil. And I think that the more surprising piece of this is, again, how brazenly and how open these actions were. And I think that we've seen actions like this in our own capital in the past, and so these are concerning.
Thank you all.
Just briefly on the funding for the Global Engagement Center, Mr. Lumpkin had mentioned $5 million previously. As I understand, in the omnibus, there is the authority to transfer up to $60 million of DOD money for specific projects in the Global Engagement Center, and then, of course, what State Department puts in. So just to let everybody know, again, it's DOD money can be transferred as well as the state money. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Garnaut, first off, congratulations on winning the Mulrooney Award in 1993 as the best and fairest player in the Australian Football League. Having grown up watching the early days of ESPN and a lot of Australian football, I didn't know there was a fair way to play it, and I'm glad to know that there is. So congratulations. And for you as well, because of your experience in Australia. I think one of the concerns I have about how we're approaching the relationship with China is that we have a defensive playbook and not an offensive one. We're not filling gaps that China is filling, where we can fill those gaps, and one of them has to do with the Confucius Institutes issue. And I'm wondering, I think another way to approach the Confucius Institutes is to actually identify these universities and maybe expand federal funding for Chinese language and Chinese culture for students so that they don't have to outsource that activity to Confucius Institutes, and I'm wondering in Australia what you're doing, since you mentioned in your testimony that universities, I think, need new processes and transparency to deal with Chinese influence on campuses. How are you approaching that there?
Well, you've hit upon a key vulnerability here. China is really providing a service that we're failing to provide, and that is China capability, linguistic capability, understanding of Chinese contemporary politics and history. So the Confucius Institutes have found a kind of, a great black hole that they can fill. So yes, we do need to work hard on rebuilding our China capability. I think that applies to the United States as well as Australia at universities. I'll just flag one thing about the Confucius Institutes is at least we know about them and people are talking about them. And in a way, that degree of transparency goes a long way to curing the problem. What I'm personally more concerned about is things that that don't have a big flag over their building. So we see other institutes and research institutes performing similar functions, but without the attention. And I think that's where we need to pay a lot more attention. But transparency is absolutely the key. I think we're unanimous on this panel. Inside universities, I can think of a couple of things to do, and it's in many cases it's up to the universities themselves, but I think there's a lot more room for transparency about the sources of funding, particularly donations. We should be honest about the political connections of money that comes. We should have more transparency about who is funding research projects, who exactly is funding research projects, and also who is funding trips to China. Junket trade is rife. We just need to, we don't want to stop it, but we need to flag it when it's happening.
Yeah, great. And I want to follow up on the point you made about consistency and sort of getting that message from the top down. So here in the U.S., we have just one agency has concluded that the Belt Road Initiative is a tool of domination for the Chinese, while another federal agency is actively trying to find ways for U.S. businesses to participate in Belt Road projects. That seems to be, to me, inconsistent, and we can decide which one we ought to choose, but it's just flat out inconsistent. Again, thinking about going on offense, and maybe Australia has looked at this question, what can the U.S. do to compete, or at least have a presence in those places where China's BRI has a presence, as opposed to just saying we're going to try to ignore it, put on blinders, think it doesn't exist, but actually have a presence in these same places where BRI is being implemented?
Yeah, the policy responses to BRI have been disjointed all around the world, and typically economic agencies will support it. They see the idea of building things and making things to be a good thing, and security agencies don't. And often it's a very messy, unmediated response that happens. We see that from a lot of countries around the world. So yes, that does highlight the central importance of elevating China and Russia policy to a higher level and pushing down the objectives and the strategies. With BRI, obviously, again, they filled a vacuum. If we're, between us, no longer supporting development in the way that we used to in my part of the world, in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, well, it provides opportunities for others. So I think that there's opportunity to do more there, but also really to focus again on transparency, because if we can just empower civil societies to do a better job, to do more of what they're doing, local communities, local media, local journalists, sunshine will cure a lot of the harm that we're worried about.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this important hearing. And I'm going to make an editorial comment real quickly before I ask my question of the witnesses, and that is, no matter what the president does or doesn't do, he's going to be criticized. If he doesn't congratulate Putin, some people would say he's not reaching out, we're going it alone, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to defend the president by saying it's important to take some of the criticism with a grain of salt. Okay, to my questions of the panel, you've already been asked about China, and you've talked a lot about that. I want to follow through a little more on that. What happens to democratic institutions in the United States and in Australia if we don't push back on the kind of influence that they're trying to exert on our political institutions as a democracy?
I might have first crack at that, but well, you lose control of the debate. So in China's case, one of the things that we've just failed to recognise and failed to address for decades, and it's allowed the problem to fester, is the extent to which China or the Chinese Communist Party has been able to co-opt friendly voices in the Chinese community, the Chinese media in our countries, and to coerce and intimidate others out of participating in the debate. So it rewards and nurtures favourable conversations and shuts down others. So we really need to go and protect people and provide safe spaces for people to have their freedom of expression, which the rest of us have taken for granted. And now we're seeing that modus operandi spread out of the Chinese communities into the mainstream. And so we've seen major efforts by China to intimidate publishers, journalists, out of participating in the conversation and to reward others. You know, they help you succeed. They find a sympathiser. They help you succeed. We need to balance that. We need to protect people who are being coerced and threatened. And where necessary, we need to create safe spaces to have these conversations. At universities, you know, untainted by political money from overseas. In the Chinese diaspora, we need to create or help or reinforce independent media platforms, because at the moment they're being completely drowned out. We're literally losing sovereignty over the public discussion places in our countries.
In addition to losing control of the narrative, you lose the audience. You lose that audience to connect with, not on just that issue, but other issues. The attention span for many people is very short. This is why social media platforms, the early 140 characters, you can captivate and actually change and influence people. But what we don't want to do is cede this space to our adversaries and lose access to the audience.
So, sir, I would just echo that by saying in military terms, we have to take the field. If the only voice in the fight is that attacking our democratic institutions, then that's all that the people will hear and will be diminished. We have to purpose to take the field.
We've talked a lot about information campaigns by the U.S. and how that's important, but sanctions in other human rights arenas has been very effective. The Russians vehemently reacted against if I say this correctly, the Magnitsky sanctions when that law was passed by Congress and signed by President Obama, and which shows that we hit a nerve. It was effective and continues to be effective. Do sanctions on high-placed officials in Russia and China have a place to play in this campaign that we're waging?
I've been outspoken on this a little bit, so let me take the first shot. Of course, our sanctions have helped, and they are effective in many ways. But if the only tool we use are sanctions, and if they are always under sanctions, they become the new normal, and they begin to diminish in effect. And the longer they're in effect, the longer they have to find out ways around them through shell companies and other things that are happening. So that's why I advocate, and as I did in my opening speech, we need a more all-of-government response. We need to look into the other silos where they are using tools against us and also open up our thoughts and imagination there.
And if I can, we're not going to message our way to, it's not a panacea. We're not going to sanction our way to get where we need. We're not going to kill our way. It's about having a layered approach in our national policies to ensure that, from a security perspective, the American people are safe.
Thank you.
Mr. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panelists for being here today. General, the question is for you. There's a saying that the best defense is a good offense. This is an adage that has been applied to many fields of endeavor, including sports and combat. I recognize that this strategic offensive principle of war might not be applicable to our nuclear defense strategy, but when it comes to our cyber strategy and our information operations, shouldn't this principle be applied? And really the question is, are we doing enough offensively? I recently visited Latvia and Estonia and Ukraine, had an opportunity to speak with U.S. and partner officials, both military and non-military, and I couldn't help but walk away, with the perception that we're just not doing enough offensively. Can you comment?
We like to say it as a fighter pilot, the best defense is your missile on the way to your enemy. So, sir, in short, I don't think we're doing enough. We've sort of ceded the offense. We're under attack. Now we have to take a more offensive reply is the way I would offer it. And it goes back to the answer I had for the other congressman, and that is that especially in the information space, we truly have not taken the field yet. And we don't have to disinform, but I believe there's a lot of truths about Western institutions and values that we can use in a more offensive way.
Look, I might take a slightly different angle on this. I think, especially in relation to China, we underestimate the amount of defensive work we've got to do. And so I think offense is a terrific conversation, but I'd first want to make sure that we've actually begun our resilience strategy at home, because if we don't have that foundation, we can't get very far. So it's just a sequencing issue for me.
And then let me follow up with you. Is it Garnaut?
Garnaut.
Okay, thank you. I want to follow up not on this question or your answer to this question, but your response to Mr. Larson about the Confucius Institutes. And we have one at the University of Maryland. They're springing up all over the country and the world. Just last month, the FBI director testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee that the Chinese government uses these non-traditional collectors like the Confucius Institutes to exploit the open research and development of the U.S. and serve as outposts, now I'm paraphrasing, of Chinese overseas intelligence networks. You suggested that it's, with the Confucius Institutes, as long as you know that they're there, transparency and accountability. My concern is that, number one, they're paid for by a government that has a modus operandi of influencing private sector, nonprofit, and academic institutions to promote its policies and its objectives. And number two, how do you police, so many universities and campuses around the world? So I guess my question is, what about a set of standards that would be applicable, and maybe even reporting, and how do you balance that with, particularly with Confucius Institutes on our college campuses where we invite freedom of expression?
I couldn't agree more about the need for standards. There's some pretty basic standards that often get put in the top, buried in the top drawer when it comes to Confucius Institutes. For example, I don't understand the need for secrecy around the contractual arrangements that are often set up. Of course, they should be transparent. They should be on the website. I don't see why Confucius Institutes, unlike almost any other similar foreign cultural organisation, needs to embed itself in universities. So going forward, I would be encouraging university administrators to keep them at arm's length. And where we see problems with Confucius Institutes, it's almost always because universities have failed to impose, even the most basic accountability. And you see the institute kind of moving or seeping into decision-making elsewhere in the university. So if you tightened up management and you improved accountability, you'd go a long way. But I'll just add that there's been such conversations, there's been such attention on the Confucius Institutes, I wouldn't want that to distract us from all the other stuff which is more difficult to see. We've got to work harder to see.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Panelists, thank you so much for joining us today. Mr. Garneau, I wanted to begin with focusing on the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative and the things that they're doing to make infrastructure investments in places like Sri Lanka, where they're developing a port there, and in Djibouti, where they built a military base. What we're seeing is, investment that's being guised as economic, that has definite strategic implications. And all you have to do is to talk about neighbors in the area. India and others feel very, very differently about the intentions of those efforts by China. Can you give me your perspective from in your testimony? You said that some of these efforts are about winning without fighting. So essentially winning by other means, and that is creating strategic blocks to I think, take away ability for other countries to do certain things and therefore take away that capability. And how do these types of what really are influence operations by China, how do they play into this strategy of winning without fighting? And can these activities be seen as tipping points for sites and other activities around the world that may include further expansions in these areas under the guise of economics for these particular nations?
Look, I think the example of Djibouti has been instructive to all of us, and Sri Lanka. So too often we're seeing that things that were advertised as just pure economic investments in infrastructure have ended up being used to this process of debt trap diplomacy to kind of to change a leasehold into freehold ownership of crucial infrastructure. So there is a real problem there. The information is now in. It's no longer an abstract hypothetical process. And it's much harder for developing countries to tackle this than robust democracies, because it's easier for the elites to be bought off and to actually sell out the interests, their national interests, without the same degree of accountability. So the pattern now is pretty striking. Those two examples that you mentioned, you could have mentioned a couple of others, including Pakistan, where the countries should never have signed up to that degree of debt, and it gives China enormous leverage, which it can use for strategic purposes. So yes, we're all on notice that this is a problem.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Garnaut. General Breedlove, the United States military, I think, has made a lot of advances along the lines of cyber issues and establishing some centers for excellence, especially the NATO Cyber Center for Excellence in Estonia has been a great example about how those things have progressed. And obviously your time there with NATO and with EUCOM, was a great part of that. But it seems like, though, on many of the other less definitive issues, the U.S. is lagging behind somewhat. And I wanted to get your take on what are the necessary steps going forward for the U.S. to do more to protect its data, and not just data in a defense system, but also data on the commercial side, to safeguard the American system from dirty money, that money that kind of makes its way through and undermines efforts for us to guard information and to keep a strategic superiority place for us, and also to restrict the influence that nations like China are having over our universities. Mr. Garneau spoke a little bit about these Confucius Institutes, but it's more than just the Confucius Institutes. That's one element of it, but there's a lot of other more clandestine efforts that are going on there to have influence, but also to gain intellectual capacity back to China. So I want to get your perspective there on those issues.
Thanks for the question, sir. And I would just disqualify myself about talking about the dirty money. I think that the answer there is what we've talked about a couple of times: transparency in business practices and standards. And that's about as far as I can go on the economic front. I think you really hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the exfil of commercial data. One of our past DNI said that we have had terabytes of proprietary data about our most advanced systems that have been exfilled from our commercial entities. And so I think we need to recognize that that is a strategic problem for the United States to include its military. And then we probably need to rally around those who are struggling. And I think in general, we look to our commercial entities to do it on their own. And so I would advocate for sort of increased collusion on how we defend these very important and valuable things. And on the restricting influence on universities, again, we run up against those things we value, which are freedoms of expression and so forth. But I think Mr. Garnaut hit it right on the head. Having some standards and setting expectations before is really important. And that then empowers the universities to not be seen as an ogre in the business, and they can adhere to those standards and expectations.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for being here. Mr. Garnaut, kind of going a little bit more into what you were just talking about, I realize that we've talked a lot about our country's offensive and defensive capabilities. Talk to me about other countries' offensive capabilities and our coordination with those other countries, if you can. How is that? How are we at that point?
Well, we're not. So this is the very early stages of a long kind of conversation. So the answer is that, you know, it only seems like yesterday we've all woken up to the defensive piece. I don't think there are many countries in this game that are actually actively working out the offensive piece, and let alone coordinating between each other. So the answer is it's all to be done.
Please.
I would just point out some exercise experience, not real world experience. In an alliance with multiple nations, each nation brings different levels of restrictions to its use of offensive power. And sometimes in these scenarios, again, in exercises, we find that while one government will not approve something, another might use their tool. And so commanders who have to deal with alliances have to understand the ability to do bilateral work inside of an alliance to use tools that may not come to the front. And I just say one more time, a third time, in exercises, we've looked at this.
Understood.
And I do have one real-world example of where this coordination has happened, and that's the counter-ISIS mission among the coalition. The messaging piece, there was a strategic communications messaging group that worked hand in glove together because of authorities of different countries, understanding of specific audiences, where we could synchronize and coordinate the messaging to make sure we hit the right message to the right audience at the right time with voices that would resonate.
Let me stand corrected. On ISIS, that's right. That there's a lot of work to be doing in actually emulating the work we've already done on ISIS, including working together.
But it appears that all of you would agree that when it comes to these revisionist countries and their guerrilla geopolitics, there's not really a coordination amongst the other nations in pushing back on them.
NATO is beginning to have those conversations.
Right.
I've been out of NATO for a little while now, so I can't speak for their most recent conversations. But
Great, great. Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In U.S. campaign finance laws, we have provisions whereby if someone wants to do political ads on radio or TV, they have to disclose who they are, who the organization is. We've never updated those laws to reflect social media platforms. Do you think that that transparency would serve the American people well? I wonder if you all might comment on that. Starting with you, General.
absolutely.
Okay.
It's a really short answer, but clearly we did not understand what has happened in our past in this, and we need to be a lot better at it in the future.
Thank you.
I think there's something there with that, but I also think that there should be some sort of credibility rating on the veracity, not just who's paying for it, but is it true? Is it not true? And I don't know if it's, you get, historically you get 5 stars because your truth over time for 20 years is the top 1% or however it works. But I think we need some sort of veracity scale to see that what's actually coming out is true and accurate.
And if I could add, on China, so China doesn't yet work the English language social media in the same way that Russia does. Maybe it's learning, maybe this is all to come. But where we've really got a problem is in the Chinese language social media systems and channels. So the fact that China has been successfully able to block out the big American platforms, the Facebooks, the Twitters, etc., has given it a near monopoly of Chinese language social media, and it follows the diaspora abroad. And so we've actually lost, these messages that are going to most Chinese language social media users in Australia and the United States are filtered through Beijing. So we've actually lost the delivery mechanism. So it's well beyond just tagging that there is some government involvement in the message. It's filtered and delivered and created by a Beijing-sponsored platform.
Thank you. General Breedlove, as a former U.S. commander for European Command, you had mentioned in recent testimony, in prior testimony, about the Russian attack against its former spy and his daughter as not necessarily an act of war, but a warlike act. In Article 5 of the NATO Charter, it speaks to the requirement for NATO members to come to the defense of any NATO member who has been attacked. The problem is what constitutes an attack, and what the Russians, I almost said Soviets. I don't know if there's a difference, but what the Russians have been developing is this hybrid, these hybrid tactics, and so it's about information operations. It's about using covert forces in conjunction to augment indigenous elements that they've stirred up within the country. They've obviously done this in the Ukraine. My guess is they could very well be looking at the Baltic states as a test to break NATO. How well defined is Article 5, and what would you anticipate a European response, a NATO response, in something that may not be a clear-cut conventional attack?
Congressman, this is a tough question that's being discussed in NATO when I left and still is being discussed. When do these, and I used hybrid in my own testimony. I really like Gerasimov's words because they illustrate what you're talking about, active measures and asymmetric methods. But Article 3, defense starts at home. Article 4, we consult with our allies to determine have we been attacked and what is the response. And Article 5 is then the collective response. So that process kind of walks through. And at the point that we are now, most of the nations are using that process individually to determine have we had an Article 5 sort of response. And so it's hard to draw the line of what is and what isn't. And frankly, I believe Mr. Gerasimov and Mr. Putin believe they can get away with different things in different countries. And to include our own, they have a line which they think they can operate to. And so it's a tough question to answer, and I can't give you a definitive piece.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this hearing. In my view, this is an extremely important hearing. And it's one of a series that I believe we ought to engage in. I recall a hearing in the Senate about a month ago now, in which the heads of the intelligence agencies, when dealing with this asymmetric warfare, said that it appeared to them that there is no risk to Mr. Putin. There's been no pushback. Last week, the Department of Energy and Homeland Security issued a bulletin that clearly said that Russia had hacked into our electric grid systems, into our power plants, including nuclear power plants, and various transportation, including airports, and that they had probably gained control of those systems. In other words, they could shut down the electric grid, they could shut down the cooling systems in power plants, probably including nuclear power plants. The question that this committee must ask, Cyber Command, who is responsible, as I understand it, for the defense of this nation against cyber attack. And by the way, the departments both said it was an act of war. The question for this committee is to ask the question of Cyber Command, are you defending the nation? And what can you do to make Russia understand that there is a risk that they will pay the price for what they have already done and what they might do in the future? So, Mr. Chairman, this is more to you, to ask you to have Cyber Command in here. I understand they may be here on April 11th, and we must ask them the tough question. Are you defending this nation? If so, how did it happen? How did it happen that the Russians are able to gain control of our key infrastructure? It should be a pretty good indication that our nation is not being defended. And furthermore, what instructions has Cyber Command or any government agency been given by the President to defend this nation and to strike back? If there is no risk, then we are at serious. If there is no risk to Russia, then we are at serious risk. This being the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Chairman, our task is to hold this administration accountable, to find out what they are doing to protect us, or what they have not done and what they could do. And until we do that, it's very clear from the ongoing information war and cyber war that there is no risk to Russia for what they have already done, which has been described by our Homeland Security, Homeland, and the Department of Energy as an act of war. Mr. Chairman, we've got a job to do here because this administration is not doing it. If any of you gentlemen would like to comment, please do. You've got 53 seconds.
I would just add that when we consider giving Mr. Putin risk, we certainly need to, as you have talked about, look in the cyber and information spaces. But as I've said already this morning, we need to also look in the other spaces. We need an all-of-government reply in these areas.
If I might, sir, in your initial testimony, you said that we needed a plan, a comprehensive plan. We don't have one, obviously. I would be delighted to hear your idea of what that might be, and obviously you won't do it in 16 seconds, but you're welcome to come back to my office or maybe to another hearing.
Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for this very, very important hearing. General Breedlove, it's good to see you again. Used to seeing you in uniform, but appreciate your expertise continued and your testimony, and just want to highlight a few things and then bring it home and then ask for your advice. You say that Russia's interference in the election is merely a symptom of the larger hybrid war against the West, in which economic, cyber, and disinformation tactics are used in conjunction with conventional forces in order to exert force pressure on the adversary. The American people need to know this, and I'm so glad we're having this hearing today. You go on and say waging a conventional war against the West would be unfavorable to Russia. As such, it has used hybrid warfare to break up Western unity, exploiting divisions in the U.S. society and promoting a cultural war is one key element of Moscow's effort to weaken the West. That is spot on. I want to bring it home. I represent part of Missouri, and I represent the University of Missouri. That is my alma mater. Here's a couple of headlines that came in my local paper there. Report, Russia sparked fear at the University of Missouri during 2015 protests. Another article, Mueller indicts Russia agency cited as origin of University of Missouri disruption efforts. We had some unfortunate protests, some discord locally on our campus, and the same people that were involved in the presidential election from Russia inserted themselves into our local issue to make the matter worse. And there was a really great report done by Lieutenant Colonel Jared Pryor, who did the research and connected the dots and brought this to light. I just want to read a couple of things that he said. He said, defendants posing as U.S. persons and creating false U.S. personas operated social media pages and groups designed to attract U.S. audiences. These groups and pages, which address divisive U.S. political and social issues, falsely claimed to be controlled by U.S. activists, when in fact, they were controlled by the defendants. He goes on and says, the role of the Russian trolls and bots wasn't to generate a controversy, but to feed and amplify it in an attempt to fan discord. And then he had another really great quote. He says, it's like when someone gets in a fight and there's someone in the back of the room saying, yeah, punch him, he'll think you're weak, egging it on. And so we have got to bring this to light. And I think as Americans, it's time that we rally as a family. You know, it reminds me back home in Missouri, we have a lot of common sense, and sometimes we have our own inner family squabbles, and the brothers and sisters may fight a little bit, but boy, the neighbor kid or somebody else want to attack our brother or sister, boy, we rally around that family and don't mess with my family. And I think as Americans, we need to wake up. This is what our adversaries are doing across the world, whether it be Russia or China. They're exploiting our own family squabbles, making them worse, making us not only fight ourselves, but fight other people and weaken the whole thing. And it's time that we wake up to this. And you conclude by saying we need to take a position, establish policy, and execute it. And all of you have given a lot of good advice, and I know we need a strategy. But I want to ask you, General Breedlove, specifically on this issue, where you have a social media from the Russians coming in, interfering with our own family squabbles. What do you think our policy should be, and what should the execution of that be? What should we do in retaliation for them interfering?
So very quickly to pile on, I use this very example as I speak around the country of what happened at Mizzou, and it was even multi-layered. After they instigated problems, they went back then and chastised the local press for not covering their disinformation and further spreading it. It was really audacious what they characterized there. The first thing, ma'am, is that America needs to understand this. There are other examples equally as bad as Mizzou surrounding removing Confederate statues, both sides being egged on by the Russians. Following, in order to try to keep oil prices down, they are instigating fights on both sides of things like oil pipelines and fracking in order to cause discord, disharmony, and to hopefully continue to suppress those efforts to keep oil prices up. And so the first step, I think, is making Americans aware that the Russians and the troll factory there in St. Petersburg, the Internet Research Agency, is out there orchestrating these battles in these spaces, and make our folks aware that when they go into their social media, they are getting an echo chamber of their own thoughts. They're really not seeing both sides, and in that echo chamber, they are being fed by these people who are trying to incite, again, on both sides of the issue. So awareness first, and then to begin to hold responsible those. And I think we need to start having tough conversations with those who prepare the social media platforms on what they allow in their spaces.
Thank you.
Mr. O'Halloran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm going to make some statements and take up some time, but I'm an old investigator here, and I look for verification of issues and gaps in issues. And we're dealing right now with an issue that if they attack our electrical grid, we can find some ways of changing the process. But they are shaping our citizens' minds. They're shaping the values of how people feel about our government and our country. And that's something that we just don't turn off. That's something that we have to gain back the trust of the American people and be able to do that. And it's not just social media. I listen to TV also, and it's, I believe, there's no verification of anything anymore. And I've heard statements of whole of government approach all year long, and I don't see it where it's working. And I heard earlier today, this is a concept that started after 9/11. So we've been 17 years of talking about whole of government, and it's apparently not working. It's hard for me to believe. I was channel surfing one time, and I saw RT on. And it took me about 5 minutes to understand what it was about. And I didn't even know at the time it meant Russia. And now here we are today, and I cannot believe that our intelligence people have not picked up on this for the last number of years. And so they either missed what was happening totally, they chose not to make it a priority, or they did not understand the consequences. Because if they knew that this was occurring and they didn't take the appropriate action over the last 17 years, then we really have a problem. We're behind by 17 years, and I believe all of you made that type of statement. And Mr. Lumpkin, you said you were scratching your head right now. And you also said that the world has changed. And I'm shaking, and silos are still there after 17 years. I find it very difficult. If I were sitting here, and if I were sitting at home as an American citizen listening to this, I would be not only shaking my head, but I'd have to question the viability of how our government addresses these serious issues on an ongoing basis. Now, I'm new in Congress, but I have to tell you that, like many American citizens, I want to be able to believe my country is going to react in the appropriate way when this occurs. And I haven't seen that at all, whether it's this hearing or subjects leading up to this hearing, that they trust their government and trust what they're hearing across the entire spectrum. We've talked about standards here today. It appears that in my lifetime, standards have not only gone down because of social media, but also because of ratings and the fact that we don't have much investigative reporting anymore. And it's all quick 30-second sound bites or 3-minute sound bites and move on to the next issue. So I have a little bit of time here, so what do you think?
I'll be really quick, sir. I think that after 9/11, we did have sort of an all-of-government response. But I think it's my opinion that we are extremely limited in our all-of-government response on issues since then. We tend to take very military approaches to Middle Eastern problems, and we tend to take very economic approaches to Russian problems.
Anybody else?
If I could just add, well, essentially we're talking about intangible harm, and it's very intrinsically hard to define and to see. So where there's no body bags, there's no explosions. So it is easy to be disillusioned on where we are. But 18 months ago, we weren't even talking about this problem. At least there is now a conversation. I'm
going to interrupt you because my time's running out.
Please.
That's the problem. We weren't talking about it.
That's right.
But I guarantee you, we knew about it. And we weren't working on it. And I guarantee you, because we knew about it, we should have been working on it. And the issue of transparency, we've talked about a lot today. We haven't defined what transparency means. We've talked the word, but we really don't know what that means. And I yield. Thank you.
Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up a little bit on what Mr. O'Halloran was talking about. And when Tom Brokaw was on the news, he was not only the anchor, but he was the managing editor of his news show. And I do not believe that Tom Brokaw would have told America a bold-faced lie. Today, it seems that we don't have anchors who are also the editors, but that the people that are on TV are simply repeating what is in a teleprompter, what their anchors are, I'm sorry, what their editors are telling them to say. And while I think it's worse on the television, I think that that's also accurate in what happens in the print media today. And so, General Breedlove, you mentioned in your testimony, Russia took full advantage of this new media landscape. And when we're talking about the weaponization of information, information can either be true or information can be false. Would it be more accurate to say that it's the weaponization of misinformation?
Yes, sir.
And then as you spoke, Mr. Garnaut, is that right? You spoke about how transparency goes a long way to solving the problem. And what transparency would do is let the American public know what is true and what is false. And if it's false, then hopefully it would not have the influence on our beliefs that it would have if it was true.
Look, just as a former journalist, let me defend journalism for a second here, and that is to point out, in Australia, it has been a handful of journalists who've really pushed the issue of foreign interference to the front of the agenda. So over several years, some hard investigative work has been done to actually illustrate the problem, put it on the front pages and start to define the harm and to show the state connections. So media still does have a role.
That may be happening in your country, but in America, a news outlet is either pro-Obama, anti-Trump, or anti-Trump, pro-Obama. I mean, that's...
It sounds tricky.
It's just the way, it's unfortunate, but most news outlets in the U.S., if we can call them news, I think media is a better way to portray them now, because I don't consider them to be news anymore, give just enough truth in their story to lead people to jump to the conclusion that they want the people to jump to, which creates the chaos. So I'm very much in favor of journalism. It's the editorialism that I think is destroying the credibility that our news outlets have with America. And if I could, I'll quote you from a Pew Research poll, and Pew does pretty good polling. 2017, this is just over a year ago, Republicans, percent of U.S. adults who trust the information they get from national news organizations, Republicans, 11%. That means that 89% of Republicans don't trust the national news. Democrats, 34%. That means 66% of Democrats don't trust the national news, and 15% of independents trust. So 85% of independents don't trust the news outlets. And I would just tell you, I think the loss of journalism, it has been one of the real problems in this country, and the bias that is out there. But if it's not the truth, then it's propaganda. And as we've seen in Missouri, I think this is going to get worse if the journalists are not allowed to tell the truth. Which brings me to you, Mr. Lumpkin. You talked about we have the infrastructure, the information, but what we don't have is a conductor. And shouldn't the journalists be the conductors? Shouldn't the journalists be allowed? What's your thought on the conductor, Alan?
You said something at the front end of your statement here, is that if it's not truth, it's propaganda. I wish it was that easy from where I sit, and maybe it's just from where I was sitting, is that, for example, this to some person is a receptacle. Other person, it's a bottle of water. Somebody else, it's a hydration device. I mean, that in conjunction with 5 different pieces of information or different stories altogether can shape somebody's mental picture of a situation. So, and that's where I think the key is you have to understand your audience and what resonates with them and what doesn't resonate with them. For example, is when at the GEC, there were some messages that worked really well in a small village in Libya that would have no take in Malaysia. Same message, but culturally they look at the world differently. So messages and information and truth are kind of, they're not an absolute, because all of those things I mentioned about this bottle of water are true. I mean, it just depends on what your perspective and how you look at it. And I think that the key is that you have to understand the audience you're trying to hit. You need to devise messaging strategies that will resonate with that audience. And then you have to have a data feedback loop. You never do, did it hit, did it take, did it move the needle on behavior? And behavior change is one of the hardest things to measure, especially in a short period of time. But you have to have, it's about a data to make sure that you're managing the process and the information. So,
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our panel of witnesses for your testimony today, and in particular, General Breedlove and Secretary Lumpkin, thank you all for your service as well to the nation. So, Mr. Lumpkin, if I could start with you, I'm a big fan, as you know, of the Global Engagement Center, and I believe that it really does have a critical role to play when it comes to countering messages perpetuated by our adversaries. And I know we've talked about the Global Engagement Center several times here today. And while I'm glad that the State Department has finally accepted the allocated transfer of funds from the Department of Defense to assist in the effort, of course, pending congressional approval, I'm still worried that it's not being utilized to its greatest potential, and that there now exists a lack of leadership guiding it towards success. I know that we've got to make better use of the Global Engagement Center, and we've got to figure out how we can better support its mission. But domestically, there's no department or agency of the U.S. government tasked specifically with protecting the U.S. public from foreign propaganda, and of course, probably rightly so, since we have to be mindful of First Amendment protections and such. But there's again no U.S. public or no one protecting the U.S. from public or from foreign propaganda or various forms of information warfare. What role do you feel that industry has to play here, and what are their responsibilities?
yeah, I think the industry does have a role. Again, I kind of mentioned earlier, again, I would love to see some sort of veracity scale on what's going out based on historic trends of whether a news piece that source is reliable or not. That's something that could be done by industry. But because of the diverse nature of media in this country, whether it's social media, print media, word of mouth, blogs, it's very, very difficult to control while protecting privacy of the American people, as well as those First Amendment protections that we have. So extremely complicated, but I do think we are at the point where we need to have some serious discussions about the best way to preserve those freedoms of Americans, but at the same time, make sure they're getting effective and accurate news.
So announced that they're looking to partner with outside experts to improve what they describe as the health of their content, with the underlying goal of, among other things, cutting down on abuse and manipulation of the platform. This is on top of several other steps that have been taken to date, which include, from what I understand, their new initiative to increase transparency of political advertisements prior to the elections this fall. Much work, of course, remains to be done still, I believe, but I'm encouraged that this is a positive step in the right direction. But how could the government work to better assist companies like Twitter to identify threats from foreign state actors who are seeking to engage in information operations against the United States? I'll start with Secretary Lumpkin, but if our other two panelists want to chime in as well, appreciate it.
I think the first step is have the dialogue. I mean, because you have to understand the privacy restrictions and privacy goals that each of these social media platforms, for example, have with their clients.
Yeah, but I think the dialogue is important, but it's going to be, I think, go beyond that, though.
Yeah, no, but I think When I got to the GEC, we had virtually no relationship with some of these social media platforms about understanding how they saw the world. We can work with them. In fact, if you see some of the things that the private sector has done to regulate content, whether it's the people screening the content or removing the hundreds of thousands of Twitter handles that have been removed by Twitter, they're doing things. We just have to make sure that we're working with them and not against them, or again, I think it's just about opening the dialogue at this point.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in?
I would just add, I agree, and I think that part of that conversation with these providers is what is their intent? What do they see as their responsibility? They are taking actions, but those actions are in sort of limited ways, and is it their intent to try to begin to ensure the veracity of data or content? That would be a good conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just say this is really a challenging problem because this is a nation-state attack, and they're using our own private companies to carry out those attacks, and they're not necessarily the ones that are equipped with being able to defend against such a nation-state attack with all the tools of statecraft and power that can be brought to bear. And this is a difficult challenge and dilemma that we've got to tackle. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. It's been an interesting conversation today, to say the least. I'd like to compliment Mr. Haller on some of the things that he had to say today, but it seems to me that our own people sometimes don't know what we've got until it's gone. And today we have an adversary that is a very patient warrior in all that they are doing. And I found it interesting. I appreciated Mr. Garamendi's passionate response to the situation today. But in my opinion, he just played into exactly what they want us to do. And I look at the election cycle. For the Russians, it was heads I win, tails you lose. If Hillary Clinton wins, we've destabilized her and criticized her. And if Donald Trump wins, then he's not legitimate. They got it coming and going either way. And then he took this issue today, and he's a friend. I appreciate his passion. But he turned it into this administration as though this problem just started in January of 17. You know, and let's not forget, Mitt Romney said Russia's our biggest geopolitical foe, and he was laughed at. Adam Schiff has said the Obama administration response to what was going on was inadequate. We got to move forward here, folks, because that type of thing, and blaming the other administrations or whatever, is not going to get us where we need to be today. And that's exactly what they want us to be doing. And we do need a whole of government, Republican and Democrat, to go after this issue and bring it more to the forefront in America's awareness. Because, you know, we always judge a country by how many want in and how many want out. And America's usually been the place where people want in to become Americans. Now we have them wanting to come in to disrupt America. And I'm curious if we're really even looking at that. But my concern is, you talked about the new normal. Sanctions would just become the new normal. And my concern is their way of life for Russia and China perceived as the new standard in the world. My question to you is, how does this affect our democratic institutions and our rule of law and what we consider international norms if they become the standard bearer of what's supposed to be normal as opposed to democracy?
Could I just comment on the importance of something you raised there, and that is, and I think in Australia we've made some progress in this respect, the importance of establishing a consensus about the nature of the problem and the principles that inform and underpin your response. And so, one, democracy is under attack. You know, that is the core of our systems, our sovereignty. Two, we will defend it against interference from all comers, whether it's Russia or China or Iran or ISIS. And once you've established, you know, a firm consensus, and then you can start building your resilient strategy. But until you've got to your consensus, you're just groping in the dark and it's all over the place.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I do. I know the name we usually use for this is hybrid warfare. I prefer the term modern warfare, because this is what we're looking at. This is not just a, you know, slice in time. This is what we're looking for in a hyper-connected world. So we have to develop strategies that are layered, comprehensive, that transcend elections, that do all of these things to protect, again, our national security and the American people. But this is not going away. As social media and new media platforms iterate, we're going to see this morph, shift, and change, and we can either be chasing our adversaries. I'd like to catch up with them now, let alone surpass them. But we need to put some more effort here.
General?
Just very quickly, I'm in violent agreement with the last couple of things you said. It's really about them attacking Western institutions, democratic values, democratic nations. And as was said in a couple of responses, they're in on both sides in a lot of these because it's not really about one side or the other winning. It's about causing a disarray and loss of confidence in the things that our citizens need to be confident in.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. General Breedlove, you talked about in your opening remarks a few examples of American interference in foreign elections in the past. To add to the examples that you gave, there was a study that was released at the end of 2016 documenting 81 elections in 47 countries between 1946 and the year 2000, where the United States either overtly or covertly sought to influence the outcome of elections in these countries, and were successful more often than not. And this doesn't include any of the CIA or military regime change overthrows that also happen in addition to this. So, you know, as recent as the Iraq War, during the Iraq War, we paid millions of dollars to plant propaganda articles in Iraqi newspapers, sought to influence Russia's elections in 1996. I say all this is to raise the question about if someone turns on cable news today and to hear a lot of the conversations here, one would think that Russia's actions in 2016, this is the first time this has ever happened, and that the United States does not have the history that we do with the tactics that we have and may continue to use. So my question is, how should anyone take the issues that you're raising and the attacks that you're citing in any context other than the historical context that exists?
So, ma'am, you made the point that I was trying to make in my opening statement, that I'm not surprised, and I don't think anyone in America should be surprised that Russia tried to influence our election because, as you have aptly described, we have been into that business in the past. And I would like to join Mr. Lumpkin's remarks in that this word hybrid war, I don't think gets it. It makes it sound new and exciting, and it's really old tools used in new ways. And what I didn't say well in my opening statement is the thing that surprises me the most is the boldness that Russia believes it can have in our spaces, that they can do these things and absolutely get away with them.
Have we lacked that boldness in U.S. actions in other countries?
As I said, I'm trying to open the conversation beyond the election to all of the elements of national power: targeted assassination, SCADA attacks, information attacks, elections. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there is a broader attack on us than just the election piece, and we need to be examining that in a holistic view, and then again, I think, replying in a holistic way.
Thank you. You know, Mr. Garnaut, you talked a lot, obviously you focused a lot on China, on China's actions, both in Australia, but generally, and in different ways that they are seeking to influence policies, elections, views, et cetera. Why, and you know, whether it's you or General, and any of you would like to answer this, why is it that, again, all we hear about is Russia's actions generally if you turn on the news, whereas there are countries like China, like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, and other countries who, purchase TV ads, who fund think tanks here in Washington, who, fund institutions in our universities seeking to achieve that same objective? Why is it that Russia's actions stand out from all of the rest that have been going on for quite some time?
Look, that's a great question, and I think one answer may be that because China's very good at it, that they put an enormous amount of effort into making sure we don't talk about what it's doing. So if you look at the pattern of influence and interference, a lot of it is about suppressing contrary voices in our systems, shutting down conversations about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and what it's doing, while nurturing others. And it's quite, and unlike Russia, where Russia seems to be, as much for a good time rather than a long time, the Chinese are strategic and patient, and they set down foundations of organisations, very consistent narratives over a long period of time. So often it's quite incremental in the way that China behaves, whereas Russia tends to do these kind of focused, sharp kind of strikes. So very different methodologies, but you could argue that but it doesn't mean that China's less important. I think that we've just failed to recognise a lot of what activity has been going on, and that needs to change, and it's starting to change, certainly in Australia, and starting to change in the United States.
Thank you.
Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, yesterday China approved a new broadcasting entity called Voice of China, which obviously is mimicking the Voice of America. And they're doing that to strengthen the Chinese Communist Party's ability to shape public opinion and to project a certain positive image around the world. Do you see this as a tool for China to use to gain influence globally? Are you concerned by it? If you are concerned by it, what should we be doing about it? I know it's pretty new, but it's something we ought to talk about.
Could I just jump in quickly? So we're talking there about an overt propaganda platform. So in the kind of the tricolour spectrum, the black, the grey, the white, this is white. Now, on its own, I think propaganda is not the main focus of our concerns. But when it becomes a problem is when it's mixed with covert and deceptive work to spread. The channels of distribution are really important. So rather than worry about the content so much, it is how is it penetrating our societies, and then I think you'll find a lot of the black and the grey operations that we should be focused on, if that makes some sense.
Did the other two gentlemen want to comment on that? One of the things that some of us who've traveled to China and certainly are trying to watch it are observing is that a country that heretofore had been holding itself back is now becoming extremely aggressive. Certainly there's some tie between that and the recent decision by the Chinese Congress to give unlimited tenure to President Xi Jinping. Should we expect for him and for the Chinese Communist Party to further these activities, to use propaganda, whether it's white, gray, or black, around the world, and particularly here in the United States?
Well, the short answer is yes. We've seen a massive intensification of Chinese covert and deceptive operations, and that has been led by Xi Jinping. So we are in a new era. I think that this pattern has been becoming increasingly clear since probably the tail end of 2013. So this is a 4 or 5 year process, and I can't see any reason why that process of intensification won't continue, perhaps for the duration of his tenure, which might be a very long time.
There's been some discussion already today about the Confucius Institutes. In some places, they are providing some more cultural information on college campuses, so they have at least a quasi-legitimate role to do that, along with other countries that do that. How do we know when the Confucius Institutes go from a legitimate activity to something that's illegitimate? And when we know about it, what do we do about it in a democracy with rights to free speech, free association like the United States?
Look, I think when we see examples of behaviour in the black, of shutting down free speech, then we actually have to be really, really tough. And if it's a pattern, then we should hold the system responsible. At the moment, I think up until now, it's been a very permissive environment. We haven't tracked how the responsibility, the Confucius Institutes and other foreign-funded institutions have been used to stifle debates elsewhere in the universities. I think we've got to be much tougher when we catch it.
Well, I would just say, Mr. Chairman, I know there's been a lot of talk in America the last year or so about Russia and what Russia's trying to do to influence things in the United States and interfere with the operation of our society and our government. But I would say that I am equally concerned about activities from China, and I hope that in some of our politically driven attention to what Russia's doing, which is valid that we should pay attention to that we don't lose sight of similar and I would say equal activities on behalf of China to try to influence and disrupt American life and our American political institutions. And so I appreciate all three of you and your perspectives on this. I hope we'll continue to study this, and I yield back.
Dr. Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we all agree that this hybrid or modern warfare, whatever we want to call it, is certainly not a new concept. I would think the Canaanites would consider the trumpets that Joshua and the Israelites blew as hybrid warfare in their time. And I would postulate that in a few years with quantum computing and the supercomputers that I'm told China now has the fastest of, the discussion we're having today about the hardware, the fiber optics that are being used will be obsolete, and we'll be talking about a completely different set of dynamics and metrics as to how to combat this. You know, I will take exception to some things that have been said about the president and the president administration being asleep at the wheel. I think this president has, for the very good thing, been able to call out what we call fake news, whether it's domestically or foreign. And this highlights where we have gone as a country, unfortunately, as to looking at how we receive misinformation or truthful information. And Secretary Lumpkin, to your statement that that bottle of water will be perceived differently from Malaysia, Syria, wherever you want to go, but in fact, of all the things it may be a receptacle, it may be this, it's still at least a bottle of water to everyone when it is front and center. So and I agree with you into your statement. Mr. Garnaut, I also agree with you that certainly some in our media have been co-opted by some nefarious governments, either state or non-state actors. Unfortunate, I don't see that changing, unfortunately. I totally agree that we need transparency in our government. We certainly have, I think, that, and we certainly need it more in the foreign fields and the foreign actors I don't think that's going to happen either, unfortunately. But we've got space wars that are fixing to happen. We have things that will start occurring that we couldn't even think of 15 years ago, probably 10 years ago. So I guess my question is, and my 2.5 minutes left, we in the United States, we welcome, we actually encourage foreign development, foreign investment in our products. We have companies that are now owned by China and other foreign governments that have knowledge and they have direct access to some of our most technologically advanced equipment. So my question to each of you, quickly, can you give me concrete examples of where this commercialization of foreign investment has directly hurt us in the national security level? General, I'll start with you.
Sir, so I alluded earlier to what I think is the real issue, and that is not through legitimate means, as you have talked about owning, but the exfil of commercial proprietary data around our most important systems. That's what worries me the most. I do have a little more confidence in committees in DOD and others, like the Low-Clo Committee that protects our secrets, and I think it's a fairly sophisticated system. I am worried about what you said, but I'm much more worried about the illegitimate exfil of data.
Thank you. Mr. Garnaut.
Just briefly, I think we've underestimated the level of sophistication and organisation of a lot of foreign-sponsored technology transfer programs. Cyber's obviously a big part of it, but also the networks of scientists, how they link back up with foreign governments. We just haven't had our eyes on the ball, and I know that Congress and other institutions in the United States are now kind of more alert to the upstream technology companies being sort of purchased by state-driven actors. So I'm confident that there is at least movement in the right direction in this field.
Mr. Secretary.
I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay. And the only thing I'll add in my last few seconds is that, General, I agree with you that, a lot of these things are intangible, at least in conceptual ability. I hope as a nation we can unite against this. Unfortunately, unless there is physical damage and physical, human life at stake, I just unfortunately don't see that happening, and that's very unfortunate. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bacon.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And I got to say for the record that it was an honor to serve under General Breedlove's command. One of the finest bosses, commanders, leaders I have ever met. And so it's great to see you back here today, sir. It is clear to me that we are under attack in a different way, and we have to be clear with our citizens with that. It is imperative that we not make this a partisan matter. This should be a unifying thing. We are under attack, and I think we got to make it clear that the Russians were trying to undermine our election and create discord. They were going after our election systems. We need to analyze that to figure out how do we defend better, make it more resilient, to give our citizens more confidence. It's clear that they're trying to penetrate our energy grid and our financial sector. The next December 7th won't be planes and torpedoes coming into Pearl Harbor. It will be preceded by rolling blackouts or a collapse of the financial sector because of a cyber attack. And we just got to realize this. We need to work now to make these systems more resilient. And it's clear that we're trying to create discord and divide us. And I think we've fallen for it. We keep falling for the bait and beating each other up. And yet we need to know that we need to be unifying and making it clear what the Russians are doing. And it's saddening to see that we've been taking the bait, and we take the bait every day, attacking each other when it's actually that's what the Russians want. And I think transparency and making that clear would help. I think on the good side, I think the president has made clear in the national security strategy that Russia is a primary threat. And I think our defense budget that we're hoping to get done here real soon makes that clear too, with our 10% increase in spending. So my question at this point is, what do you think their goal is? I mean, we know that they're trying to create discord, but that's a means to an end. What is their end? What is the purpose of the discord and the partisan divide? General Breedlove, thank you.
Right back at you, sir, about your experience as a commander. Thank you. So let me, as I think my colleague tried to do, give the press some relief. What we do now see is that institutions in America and the press, universities and others, think tanks all around the country are beginning to speak to what has been happening for some time. It's been a slow awakening, but people now are understanding primarily what Russia is doing, less so what the PRC is doing. But so I think we need to not be hypercritical because folks are beginning to wake up to this. And that's the most important thing. We need to reach my brothers and sisters in small town Georgia with this message so that they understand what's going on. And as I've said just before, I really believe that while they do have some short-term goals to try to push forward one or the other of approaches, it's really about destroying the confidence in America and American democracy, I think, in the end game.
You think it's also maybe a goal to give them a freer hand with their neighboring countries? What they're doing in Ukraine. If we're divided here, it's harder to come up with a unified response to other matters internationally.
So now I would answer sort of in the role of the former EUCOM and NATO commander. Clearly, they wanted to find cracks in our alliance, expand those cracks, live in those cracks, to destroy a unified response by the alliance.
Would you say we're in a Cold War now, or is that an appropriate term?
I think we're in a warm war.
A warm war. Any other comments from our two panelists?
It takes time to establish audiences. So you want to establish an audience well before you need or want to use it. You need to build the tentacles, you need to have the infrastructure, it takes time. So I think what we're seeing, in my view, is that not what today is a prelude to something in the future. I just can't tell you what that is.
One of the things that it seems to counter what they're doing, we need to see what are their weaknesses. We know they're very dependent on the energy sector. They're very concerned about what we're doing in the Baltics and Poland. It just seems to me that there are some leverage points that we also have that we need to be exploring more aggressively. But any comments to that? And before I
in 15 seconds, I would say we need to be intellectually honest enough to know that there's two sides to every story, and we need to understand what is motivating the Russian leadership. And I'm not sure that we're very good at that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Cheney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. This has been very enlightening. You know, the first thing I would say is I think there is general bipartisan agreement you've heard for the most part on the committee about the threat, but I think it's really important for us to recognize that the strength of our system is debate, and the strength of our system, you know, the sort of explosion of different sources of information is not a negative. And I certainly, frankly, personally wouldn't want to return to a time, I'm not sure a time ever existed, frankly, where there was one source of information. And I do think that our adversaries have been genius in many ways at exploiting what is a strength, but people ought to have the ability to choose from different sources of information and not expect that every single source is going to be some sort of, you know, approved, verified version of the truth. My question, though, or my first question is for you, General Breedlove. You know, we are very concerned, I'm very concerned that the administration has not issued, does not have any sort of a cyber policy. Even though this committee has called for it, it's crucial. I'm not sure how we move forward without that. But it seems to me that we've got to be in a position where we're not just thinking about what is our response to these attacks, but we're talking about deterrence. And that requires some kind of a template. And a template that says, look, there's a public diplomacy piece of this, there's an information piece of this, we need to be spreading the message about the importance of freedom and democracy, but there's got to be a line someplace where it becomes an act of war against us, an attack on the power grid, an attack on our election process. So my question is, first of all, can you be a little bit more specific about where that line is? And secondly, when you talk about an all-of-government approach, could you be more specific about the deterrent piece of this in terms of what are the kinds of things, even from the perspective of a declaratory policy, that we would be, you know, saying to the Russians, to the Chinese, you step over this line, these are the kinds of responses you'll meet from us?
So thank you for the question, ma'am. I would just say that I don't label just this administration as not having these policies. These span administrations. We've been crying for certain policies since the first attack in Crimea, Ukraine, and other places. So these are things that I think all governments, regardless of which administration is running.
There's just one in office now.
That's right. We need these things in the tools of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and others as they respond. I have sort of been boring today by saying all of government response. We tend to, as I said, do economic things with Russia and military things in the Middle East. And I think that we need to sit down and be more direct about asking our interagency governmental process to bring diplomatic, informational, military, and economic tools in each case. And for each country, there are different responses.
But would you be in favor, for example, General, of saying, you know, that any of our adversaries, no matter who it is, a particular kind of attack, they ought to expect that will be met with a particular response from us that may or may not be in kind?
I do believe that we need to understand how to deter. I'm not a huge fan of red lines because when we draw a red line and then we don't stand behind it, it's catastrophic. And so I would be careful in how I did that, but deterrence is in the mind of those deterred. It's less about writing something on a piece of paper, and we need to make sure we understand what gives Mr. Putin cost so that we can deter him.
Mr. Lumpkin, could you address this issue as well in terms of what are the kinds of things that would be most likely to deter action, and do you think that there's a particular line in terms of the kinds of actions against us we ought to be focused on deterring?
Yeah, I think it goes back to General Breedlove's comment. It depends. And it depends on if we're talking about Russia, you're talking about China, you're talking about the Iranians. Each one has different points and places that pressure could be applied to have the outcomes, whether they're broad or very narrow to achieve. But what you do have to have is a process to make sure that you don't get locked into something you can't get yourself out of ultimately as you design these strategies for specific countries.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome and thank you for this very important hearing. And General Breedlove, thank you for your service and what you continue to do at Georgia Tech, and I welcome the students as well, although I'm a Bulldog through and through. Glad to work with you. I want to go back to what you were discussing a little while ago but didn't have time to get into regarding the energy. In your written testimony, you stated that Russia is using its vast energy resources to promote the dependence of its smaller neighbors and to keep them from turning to the West. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that, please?
So if I could just use a few examples from the Ukraine piece, and it's happened in others. When Russia is trying to bring pressure on a government, in Ukraine's case, calling in payments early, raising the price of the fuel to bring problems, or withholding delivery so that households would go cold in a very cold Ukrainian winter. So there are lots of tools they use. Russia has an elaborate, as you know, pipeline set up in Eastern Europe, Western Russia, in order to be very good at this, moving gas around. And so it is a tool they can use. And then what I mentioned also in the testimony in the Q&A is that Russia, of course, is very keen on keeping the price of oil up because it is very much an oil-dependent economy. And so it attacks into countries like ours to prevent ventures like pipelines, fracking, other things that would tend to suppress the price of energy. And so they are very keen to try to influence governments like ours in that respect.
Okay, so what about our potential ability to export LNG, wood pellets, that type of thing? What kind of impact would that have?
Much talk about how we might, in the West, larger than us, Canada and others, be a big part of reducing Eastern European dependency on Russian energy. I believe it would be a great tool.
Okay, so a great tool on multiple fronts, obviously, for the national security of Europe. Is that what you refer when you say a great tool?
And the United States.
And the United States. All right, what other methods do we need to be aware of and have on our radar to help combat this hybrid warfare, specifically energy?
I'll get back to you on that, sir. Right now, I think that the first and foremost on us is to be able to reduce our dependence, and now I'm offering Phil Breedlove's opinion, to increase our own capacity to create, and then to offer to our allies cheap energy that we can deliver to reduce their dependence on those that would use its coercive capabilities.
All right, that sounds like a great plan to me. Either of the others have comments on this? Okay, thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go through pretty quickly because I have 7 questions and I'm determined to get through all of them. So the first one is for you, Mr. Lumpkin. Is the State Department the correct place to have this conductor, setting aside some of the issues with the Global Engagement Center? Do you believe that state is the best place for this point person to be?
I think it needs to be outside of all the departments.
Outside of all the departments. Okay, so what, functionally, how would that work? Would it be similar to the DNI in terms of having all the, setting aside intel, having the appropriate agencies be a part of that process?
I think so. It's the only construct that I know that's cross-cutting across all departments.
Okay. Within DOD, who is the conductor?
It's a great question because Public Affairs has a conductor at DOD that's in the information space, and you have military information operations that resides oversight at ASD SOLIC.
Right. So I asked that question to highlight something that I think we need to focus on. On the Subcommittee for Emerging Threats and Capabilities, we have quarterly briefings when it comes to CT and when it comes to cyber operations. And the briefer is able to go around the world and say globally what the threats are and what our operations are. I fear that if we had quarterly briefings, we would not have one point person who is able to answer our questions region by region by region. So, are those models that we should use as we seek to tackle I/O? So what we've worked through over the past 14 years on CT, what we're currently doing in terms of elevating cyber command?
Yeah, I think that the Joint Staff J39, which is their operations shop that's an information operation, should be able to give you and represent what each of the combatant commands is doing with regard to information operations, keeping in mind that the information operations piece supports military objectives.
So do you think that's an important kind of forcing mechanism in terms of congressional oversight, thinking about having quarterly briefings on I/O?
I do, and I would recommend it.
Okay. What role does Cyber Command have in terms of I/O?
I mean, they're because
What role should they have?
I mean, because they're largely in the intelligence community, not in the information space. There is a role. But it is a narrow niche.
General Breedlove, you're nodding your head. I'd like you to add to that.
It was a great question. That's what I was nodding my head to. And in the end, Cyber Command is more about the medium by which information is transferred and how to adjust and control and, if necessary, defend and attack in that medium. So I was shaking my head as I was trying to think through the answer. There's not a good answer right now.
All three of you referenced the strategic communications messaging strategy when it comes to countering ISIS. Can you specifically talk about how this is structured, both, within who the players are within DoD and state, how we work with our allies, and then the reason I'm asking that question is, if we were to identify the top threats in the I/O space, I would list Russia, China, and potentially Iran as top three. I'd love to get your assessment on the specifics of how that's structured, what we can learn there, and whether you think those three threats are where we should prioritizing having messaging strategies when it comes to those adversaries. Mr. Garnaut, do you want to go first on that?
Look, if I understood your question correctly, but let me just talk about so when you're talking about Russia information operations, it tends to be the military piece or the cyber piece and a little bit of the astroturfing of protest movements. But kind of China's in a broader space, and so it doesn't have a direct bureaucratic counterpart in our systems, and that's part of the problem, right? So we need to create a place where it all comes together, and I agree with Dr. Lumpkin, it has to be above the bureaucratic systems. But when we've got to have, as part of our law enforcement, capability and ability to track United Front networking operations, to see it spread across all the silos of our systems. And it's much bigger than just the military piece or the cyber piece. It's a whole of public opinion emphasis.
So let me rephrase my question. Since we have what the three of you have said is a successful strategy when it comes to countering ISIS in the information space, do we need to come up with threat-specific equivalents when it comes to countering Russia, countering China, and countering Iran in terms of our prioritization?
Yes. The way the construct is in the coalition against ISIS, we had a communications working group where we would go and we'd meet quarterly, and we would sit there and hammer out, the messages, the audiences, and how we were going to work it against a single adversary. And it was an ad hoc group, worked very, very well. But I think you have to be focused on who is the adversary and what are the outcomes you're looking for.
General Breedlove.
So what made this coalition and this capability successful is that the leadership of our nation and other nations in the coalition gave them the authority, responsibility, and accountability to take on the mission. And I would argue that that's where we're missing in the arrangements with Russia and China. We haven't really given one entity, like maybe the Global Engagement Center or some other entity that is uber other entities. We haven't given them that policy, authority, responsibility, and accountability.
Thank you. My time's expired.
If y'all will indulge me for just a couple more, probably brief questions. I'm sitting here thinking, as I listen to all of this, I'm sitting up thinking about all of the effort we put into understanding the Soviet Union and the philosophy behind it and the tactics it was using around the world. It was enormous. And then it all went away. We're starting to rebuild, for example, our understanding of deterrence and thinking about these things again. My simplified question to y'all is, from kindergarten to PhD level, where are we today at understanding the influence operation? I kind of like psychocultural warfare myself. Where are we in understanding what's going on to us? General?
I'll start with something, sir, I said to you when I was wearing uniform. We have backed up, and probably for right reasons, not at the height of the Cold War, but when the wall fell in the early 90s, we had over 12,000 analysts on Russia. And when I testified to you in uniform the last time, we had 1,028. So we had cut our capability to look into Russia and understand Russia by 92 or so %. And so I would answer that we are back in junior high or maybe entering high school, and our intel communities are refocusing. Harvest Bear, other things they're doing, sir, I think they're on it, but we have work to do.
Okay.
Look, on China, I'm not sure that we're at kindergarten yet. The amount of analytical capability we've got is so small. I can count on my hand the number of experts on Chinese influence operations. One of them's in this room up the back. Peter Mattis, Mark Stokes, a couple of people in Australia. It is unbelievably thin, and that's got to be a major priority in building up analytical capability on Chinese politics, Chinese history, and patterns of hybrid warfare.
Just briefly, based on your experience, is there the appropriate exchange between analytic experts here and in our most valued allies like Australia on this issue?
Well, yes. I think the flow of information and analysis is really quite strong between Australia and the United States. This is a topic that comes up often, but we just don't have the depth of capability. We don't have enough to share at this stage.
Yeah, okay. Ms. Lumpkin, what grade are we in?
I was going to address the Iran issue, and I would say we're probably in middle school somewhere.
And where?
In middle school, junior high as well, just because of the number of resources we have against it. It's very small.
I just want to go back at the end to the central purpose of this committee, and that is overseeing the Department of Defense and the U.S. military. Taking all of your points about whole of government, the importance of intelligence and law enforcement and all of that, can you provide just a few comments on the role of the United States military in dealing with the problems that we have discussed today?
I don't want to pump sunshine, but I would offer to you that there are some really brilliant people working hard on this issue. And I have absolute trust and confidence in Joe Dunford and in our Secretary of Defense, because I've watched them, served with them, et cetera, over the years. And I know that inside of the Joint Staff, General Dunford is doing some work on trying to reorganize around Russian issues. I led one of those efforts in uniform, and Harry Harris, as the commander of PACOM, led a similar issue as we looked at China and building a broader rubric under which to address these than just the combatant commanders, and reaching out in those processes to other governmental agencies to bring them in. So, sir, I'm encouraged by what I see inside of our DOD and our uniformed military services on how they're approaching this.
And sir, the Department of Defense is carrying a lot of water on this front. They're carrying a lot of water for the interagency, but everything can't be tied back to a military objective. And that's where we fall short. Our gaps and seams are massive. And the GEC, frankly, and during my tenure, would not have been functional at all if it wasn't for the detailees that came over from the Department of Defense because the positions themselves weren't resourced within the building. So again, I think the U.S. government's efforts are maturing, but the Department of Defense is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for us.
Okay. Mr. Garneau, in a broader sense, military role in this space?
Look, I think military systems and defense departments have had to pull too much weight here because almost by default, because the rest of the system haven't been carrying their weight.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true here.
Yeah, especially the law enforcement piece.
Yeah, okay. All right, this has been very helpful. Thank you all for being here. A lot of insights gained. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Hearing stands adjourned.
Pleasure.